In the film Blue Velvet, one of the characters says to another something like, "In a few minutes, you're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you." That's how I feel about the story of Professor Newton Arvin and the scandal that threatened to ruin his life and the lives of two of his colleagues. Though this episode doesn't include a murder, I would say the stakes are impossibly high and the outcome life-altering. Thanks for joining me for Newton Arvin, A Sign of the Times. Frederick Newton Arvin was an extraordinarily gifted man. He was born on August 25, 1900, in Valparaiso, Indiana, the fourth of six children. His early life was filled with many of the same things that would fill his adulthood: a love of literature and a profound sense of isolation and loneliness. He was distant from both of his parents, later saying his father thought him effeminate and weak. Arvin attended Harvard, graduating summa cum laude in 1921. He joined the English department at Northampton, Massachusetts Smith College in 1922 at the age of 22, where he would remain for the next 38 years. Starting in 1929, Arvin wrote several celebrated biographies of Hawthorne, Whitman, and Longfellow, winning the 1951 National Book Award for nonfiction for his 1950 biography of Herman Melville. By the time Arvin won the National Book Award, he was a respected literary critic and much admired by his students and colleagues, but none of this would protect him from the coming storm. Around the same time as Professor Arvin was establishing an academic career, Arthur Ellsworth Summerfield, who had been one of the country's leading Chevrolet car dealers, was beginning to taste a bit of political power. In the early 1940s, Summerfield came to the attention of the Republican leaders in Michigan when he arranged for General Motors to donate funds to the Michigan GOP. In 1952, Summerfield delivered the needed $75,000 to purchase the airtime for Nixon's famous Checkers speech. In 1953, after Eisenhower's election, Summerfield was appointed Postmaster General, and almost immediately, his zeal to ban obscene materials from being sent through the U.S. mail began. Summerfield had a long list of literature he wanted to ban, everything from Lady Chatterley's Lover to the Aristophanes play Lysistrata, first performed 2,400 years ago. W. H. Auden referred to the mid-20th century as the age of anxiety. The fact that the tranquilizer pill was introduced and became hugely popular nearly overnight in the 1950s explains a lot. For most queer folks, anxiety and fear were a fact of life. Homosexuality was illegal and still considered a mental illness. In April of 1953, President Eisenhower signed an executive order that paved the way for gays and lesbians to be thrown out of the military and federal jobs. In 1961, 1 year after the events of this story, sodomy was redefined to include any sexual act between same-sex partners. Overall, there was a societal and governmental effort to shame being queer out of existence. Despite the prohibitions and risks, as human beings are wont to do, Newton Arvin and others like him sought love, sex, and companionship. In 1946, Newton Arvin met Truman Capote at Yaddo, a writer's retreat in Saratoga Springs, New York, and they fell in love. The 21-year-old Capote was working on his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, published in 1948, which he dedicated to the 46-year-old Newton Arvin. The relationship helped both men in life-changing ways. Capote helped Arvin become less ashamed of his homosexuality. He introduced Arvin to gay New York and helped to broaden his perspective. Capote, who was not college-educated, benefited from Arvin's erudition, saying later, "Newton was my Harvard." The times made same-sex relationships difficult to maintain, and soon the differences between the two began to be magnified. Arvin liked his solitude and was put off by Capote's flamboyance and lack of self-consciousness. Arvin also seemed to need a helpmate, so when Capote's Other Voices was published, he became quite famous and public, which put an end to the love affair. The romance ended in 1948, but the two remained friends for the rest of Arvin's life. In 1957, Roth versus the United States tested the notion of what was obscene. The resulting decision, which pleased neither conservatives or liberals, was popularly named the Roth test, which defined obscenity as materials that appeal to prurient interests and lacks redeeming social importance. The vagaries of the decision both blocked Summerfield from taking sweeping action while allowing him to continue on a case-by-case basis to seize books and magazines being mailed across the United States. Having failed to successfully confiscate or prosecute most booksellers or consumers who received literature deemed obscene, Summerfield and his office turned their attention to the low-hanging fruit of homosexual erotic materials. In 1959, the postmaster inspector in Alexandria, Virginia, confiscated 405 copies of 3 Beefcake magazines. Beefcake magazines featured bodybuilders and other athletic men in posing straps with no frontal nudity. What helped give these magazines an aura of smut was their intended audience. There were bodybuilding enthusiasts, of course, but the gay male audience made the material obscene in the eyes of folks like Summerfield. In August of 1960, Newton Arvin's on and off relationship with Edward Spofford was in a fallow period. They had met at a Christmas dinner in 1957, and a romance soon followed. Arvin called the 26-year-old classicist a very serious young man. He was hooked. Soon the courtship was ringed in prose by Ovid, Virgil, and Dante. Over the next few years, Arvin and Spofford would vacation and work together, but eventually the strictures of love in the closet meant their romantic relationship had run its course. But a friendship remained. From time to time, the two men would hang out with another professor from Smith, Joel Dorius. Dorius had earned a PhD in English literature from Harvard. At Smith, he specialized in British Renaissance and 18th century literature. In his biography, The Scarlet Professor, Barry Worth describes in heartbreaking detail Dorius's fear of discovery. He had a collection of male erotica in a suitcase, and he'd have to psych himself up to take the suitcase out of its hiding place. But he would occasionally share the photos and magazines he'd collected with Arvin and Spofford. By 1960, authorities investigating individuals who received Beefcake magazines through the mail was well underway, and in one of these sweeps, Newton Arvin was identified as a recipient. On September 2nd, 1960, Arvin was at home alone when some forceful banging interrupted the silence. It was 2 detectives. They were there to take him into custody on charges of possessing and distributing obscene homosexual material. As I said earlier, one of the expressed goals of these moral crusades was to shame homosexuality out of existence, and that was the tone undertaken in Arvin's interrogation. The detectives didn't have to use a great deal of force. Instead, they used shame as their ammunition and the threats of ruining Arvin's reputation as the weapon. The arrest and the exposure were Arvin's worst nightmare. The police pressed him to name names, and it didn't take him long to give up Dorius and Spofford. If Arvin thought that his cooperation left him in the shadows, he couldn't have been more wrong. While straight people who had been caught up in this morality trawling suffered legal consequences such as fines, they were often dealt with in a quiet manner. Gay men were made an example of and publicly shamed. On the same day as Arvin's arrest, Spofford returned home and was met on the stairs by a panicked neighbor telling him that there were strangers in his apartment. He and Dorius were arrested and charged with receiving and sharing homosexual pornography. When Arvin and Spofford finally spoke, Arvin suggested they commit suicide. Spofford declined. Like many other gay men of this period, Spofford had long resigned himself to the likelihood that he would wind up in police custody for the crime of being gay. Arvin moved away from the idea of taking his own life, but he did have himself admitted to a hospital between court appearances. On September 20th, 1960, Spofford and in turn Dorius both received a 1-year suspended sentence and a $1,000 fine. They were both allowed to plead not guilty, which would help facilitate an appeal. Newton Arvin was ordered to pay $1,200 as a fine. Authorities concluded that he was the ringleader. Like the others, he got a 1-year suspended sentence. The arrests were a sensation, splashed across the newspapers in Massachusetts and across the country, with details supplied by the police and Postmaster General. Before the legal consequences were squared away, and while the press frenzy swirled around them, Arvin received a note from the president of Smith College that read, "Dear Newton, in light of the charges under which you've been arraigned, the college has concluded to relieve you of all academic responsibilities and grant you a leave of absence with pay until a judicial decision has been reached in your case." He sent the same letter to Spofford and Dorius. Following the scandal, Smith College trustees terminated Spofford's untenured position. Dorius got the chop as well. Though colleagues supported the men, their careers at Smith were over. As a tenured professor, Arvin was left with half of his salary and was suspended permanently from teaching at Smith College. In 1963, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled that the magazines the three men had been arrested for possessing and sharing were not pornographic. One of the justices said, after an independent examination, the most that can be said about the magazines is that they are dismally unpleasant, uncouth, and tawdry. That same year, a lower court ruled that the arrest and the confiscation of the magazines were done without a warrant, and all the charges against all three men were dropped. By the time of the decision, the three men had scattered. In California, Spofford was teaching at Stanford University. He remained there until he retired. He died in Stanford, California in 2013. Dorius had left the United States for Germany, where he taught at the University of Hamburg. He returned to the United States to teach at San Francisco State University in 1964. He lived in San Francisco until his death in 2006. In Massachusetts, Arvin's confidence slowly began to return. The same year that his conviction was overturned, his biography of Longfellow was published and well received. This newfound sense of relative well-being wouldn't last, though. Newton Arvin was diagnosed with cancer. Friends wrote Spofford to tell him how much Arvin wanted to see him. Spofford did not reply. By March of 1963, Newton Arvin was dead. In the years after his death, one of Arvin's colleagues said his work was mostly forgotten, subsumed by the scandal and the changes that the 1960s brought about. But a closer examination shows that while that might be true of the man himself, Arvin's works are still taught in universities across the United States. On the other hand, despite all the havoc that Summerfield caused, his efforts failed. He did not reshape the moral foreground of the United States. Unlike Arvin, it's Summerfield whose work and crusade faded into the bigot's morass where people like Jerry Falwell and Lester Maddox dwell. We would all like to think that if we were in Newton Arvin's position, we wouldn't name names, but I would posit that he and thousands of queer people like him should never have been forced to make such a horrible decision in the first place. This episode is my love letter to Newton Arvin and all the other men and women before and after him, whose names we'll never know. Join me in sending love and appreciation for their genius, their courage, and their sacrifice. Thanks for joining me. Please subscribe to the channel.